Welcome to the Man Rules Podcast. If you're looking to live with more intention, build connection, and live a more authentic, meaningful life, you're in the right place. I'm your host, Dan Griffin. I don't know about you, but it seems to me that they keep changing the rules for us men without telling us. So each week, I just throw out the rule book and cover the tough topics about the real issues that men face. At the end of the day, I'm not here to tell you what kind of man you're supposed to be. I'm here to help you make your own rules and become the kind of man you want to be. So let's jump in. All right, welcome back to another episode of the Man Rules Podcast, where we don't let the rules rule us. Back with us is Rick Belden. He and I have had some amazing conversations about the father wound, about the mother wound, and now we're going to be talking about another topic that, man, I tell you, a lot of people don't want to talk about, but especially men, and that is the whole experience of grief and sadness, and what does it mean for men to carry grief around, and how do we manage, how do we even be able to begin to see the grief we have, let alone touch the grief we have, let alone heal from the grief we have, let alone allow that to be something that transforms our lives. It's a big topic. But I'm going to start it off with this way, and I'll let Rick respond after I make this statement. If you are a man living in this society, you have grief. Rick?
Hey, Dan. Yeah, thanks for having me back on. I'm very happy to discuss this topic with you. And as you said, I was in the process of reviewing some notes before this, and I almost got overwhelmed at the amount of information that I was looking at that we could bring into this short conversation. So that's a very good question to start with. I think the answer is an unequivocal yes to your question or your statement that, you know, if you're a man in this society, you have grief. I don't know how a man could be in this society and not have grief, given the scarcity of channels and opportunities, and really the lack of skills that we enter the adult world with as men to process anything in the realm of grief. So I would say, if I had to just kind of make a blanket statement, the answer is yes.
Well, and you know what's fascinating for me in the trainings and the talks I do, I always have the audience name the man rules. And that's a big part of just the consciousness raising. So we always name the man rules, and I don't do it. And I tell you, 99 out of 100 times, the very first rule they give me is what? Real men don't cry.
Yep.
And of course, grief is so much bigger than that. But if that's the first thing people think about when they think about the man rules, or when they think about masculinity and think about men, I mean, think about just how powerful, you know, that is, like how soon it starts that we take that piece away from men, just to be able to be vulnerable, to feel sadness, to feel anything other than anger and stoicism. I mean, all of that is connected to grief. And man, I mean, I'm not going to go into all the details, but I will simply say this has been a challenging year for me. And a lot of it has been some of the grief that I've been carrying, and some of the work that I've been doing professionally, and the talks that I do, and the topics I take on, and the intensity of all that has brought a lot of grief to the surface, and I sure as hell wasn't dealing with it. And so having to look at that, and then just to look at how hard it is as a 45-year-old man who believes so deeply in this topic of conscious masculinity, this topic of men, you know, men's awareness and men kind of living more conscious lives. Despite how deeply I believe in that, how incredibly difficult it has been and continues to be to give myself permission to feel grief.
I can totally relate to what you're saying, because, you know, as I was, again, preparing for a conversation today, I found myself sort of frozen in a moment where I felt like, God, I almost feel like I'm a fraud talking about these things sometimes, because I still have it's still such a challenge for me. And I still kind of reflexively shut myself down often. There were at least 2 moments today when I felt something coming up or a result of something I thought about or saw. And instead of, as you said, giving myself permission to allow that, I immediately went into task mode and said, no, I don't have time to grieve right now. I have to get ready for this conversation about grief.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and it's almost like, I mean, if I were a man listening to this podcast, I mean, I think we're going to have to make sure that we don't even title this Men in Grief in some ways, because it's such a scary topic for men, that immediately it's like, we don't allow the continuum of grief or experiences that we would consider grief. But a trap that you and I can both fall into that I think we both need to be very careful about. And I don't think it's a trap that's too hard to avoid, is like, look, you and I care about this topic, but we don't stop being men. We don't stop being impacted by the man rules. We don't stop trying to figure out, what kind of men to be. We don't stop being impacted by the trauma of decades, 4 decades for me, 5, almost 6 decades for you, of, how this has all affected us. The only thing that we have to do, and the only obligation I have, and I ask anybody who comes on to this podcast, is to not present it as though we are experts who have done all the work and we're like coming from some place on high. I mean, it's like we're as much in the shit as anybody else, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And it's interesting. I had an image come to mind just now while you were talking of the old, back in the, pre-Columbus, pre-World Explorer days, they used to draw those maps of the Earth, which they thought was flat. And at the edges of the Earth, there was just a drop off, where if the ship sailed past the edge of the Earth, it just dropped off into an abyss and everybody was lost. And that's how grief has felt to me a lot of the time. And it just occurred to me that, obviously that's not the reality. It's a mapping problem, because we're talking about emotional territory and psychological territory for us as men that has not been mapped out well for us. And so it's just like stepping into the great unknown, which all too frequently feels like stepping off the edge of the Earth. But that's not the reality of it. It's just that it's not well mapped.
That's beautiful. That's so well said. And it does feel like it. And I don't care how many times you've enabled yourself to grieve, it does feel like that. And the other thing I would say is the mechanisms, the psychological and even neurological, possibly even physiological mechanisms that get instilled and installed into men at a very early age. I mean, it came up for me. It comes up for me all the time. I feel this wave of sadness and it's like, bam, shut it down.
Yeah.
Like shut it down, swallow it. Don't do anything to acknowledge it. Comes out sideways as anger down the road. It comes out as sarcasm, or there's just this really quick message of shame toward myself or somebody else who's expressing sadness. I mean, all of that comes from, I think, men's unresolved grief and inability to just give ourselves permission. And I think it's hard even for other people to, well, I don't should say, I know it's hard for other people to be with men when men begin to experience grief too. It's so foreign to our ideas of masculinity and so deeply foreign. I mean, it's not just foreign on the surface, it's foreign all the way down in the tectonic plates of our consciousness.
Individual and group.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's like that's why I love these topics that I do with you, is it's like, man, this is the shit that nobody wants to touch. And we've got a lot of listeners who are like, grief, at some level, they probably have that thing that men don't have, grief. Men might occasionally cry if they don't win the big game or if somebody dies. That's usually the thing, right? If you do a survey with men, you say, when's the last time you cried? Almost inevitably, it's like, well, when so-and-so died. And even then, grief is seen as this acute sort of phenomenon or like this one-time deal as opposed to a journey.
Right. And I was reminded today, I was out walking this earlier today, kind of mulling all of this over, and an experience came back to me that was it was really a rite of passage for me in terms of my ability to feel and express grief, and not, I would say, in a positive way. I remember when I was in, I think, 7th grade, one of my favorite teachers, one of the first male teachers I had, was killed in an auto accident, and the driver that hit his car was drunk. And I remember at the time, I just let it all out. I cried, I raged, everything was available to me. And then about 2-3 years later, my paternal grandfather passed away suddenly, had a heart attack. And he was truly a patriarch on that side of the family, very much beloved, and passed away, as I said, very suddenly. And I remember I went to the funeral, and we went back to my grandparents' house for the after-funeral activities. I sat in a chair. I was totally numb. Other people were crying. I could not feel anything. And I finally went upstairs to one of the bedrooms, laid on the bed, and just went to sleep. And honestly, Dan, I was thinking about it this morning. I don't think to this day I've ever cried about my grandfather passing away. Something changed in the space of a couple of years between middle school and the beginning of high school, and somehow I started shutting down. I didn't even understand what was happening to me. And I could still feel that numbness in myself today when it came up. It's still there.
That's so poignant and so true. I mean, I think it's one of the rites of passage in this country and in our society and in a lot of countries, that part of becoming a man is you stop acting like a little bitch or a little pussy or a baby or a wimp and all those pejorative terms that we use. But at some level connected to that is we man up, and man up means you don't cry. Man up means you don't show fear. Man up means you take that vulnerability and you tuck it away. And, we pay for it, and we pay for it dearly, but it makes complete sense. And that was an experience that I had. And, what was interesting is I thought we were doing our podcast for a little bit. I thought we were doing our podcast last Friday, and I thought it would have been so perfect for us to have done it last Friday because that was the anniversary of my father's death.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And it still works to be doing it a week later. But, it's been 22 years. It's such a powerful experience. And there's still grief there. There's still all the grief I didn't allow myself. Then there's the grief because of this whole new layer of personal growth and personal work that I'm doing with the therapist and with my own recovery and all of that. Then there's the grief that comes from a daughter who never met her grandfather and is so interested in him and loves him so much. She has no experience of him other than that. And then there's, just the connection that I have to him and always will have to him as far as my best of myself and the not so best parts of me. All of that is part of the grief. And yet last Friday, when I took some time to just reflect, it ended up, there was not a lot of emotion there. And I'm not saying there has to be, but I think that whatever it is that we do as adolescents, and there might even be some people out there who think it's just a necessary biological sort of response, or that's some like they'll talk about it as though that's just how it is, but it's clearly a significant part of becoming a man.
Yeah, and it's funny, as you were speaking, I realized it's like, well, yeah, this is you talked about the anniversary of your father's passing being last Friday, and I just clicked. It's like, well, yeah, this is the same time of year that my grandfather passed away. So it's just interesting how these things come up. And that kind of goes to one of the topics today, I think, is like, I think we're very commonly driven by things that we're not aware of. And I've had the experience many times of having an off day, or why am I feeling so surly, or why do I feel so sad today? And then I'll realize, oh, it's the anniversary of this or that. These things have a way of staying with us, even if we make a conscious, willful decision that we feel like we've done enough and we're not going to do anymore.
So I'm thinking of our listeners again, right?
Sure.
And I'm thinking of me being somebody who, let's say I'm a man who's listening, and I don't necessarily have a lot of experience with this stuff, but I immediately have this voice that comes up that says, get over it. Or it was a long time ago. Dan, like even that judgment I have of myself, but I can certainly imagine other people having, like, Dan, it was 22 years ago, dude. Like, that's a long time. Are you really still grieving your father? And what do you say to the men who very, very understandably, very, very reasonably respond by saying, that's just not my thing, man. Men in grief, I don't have grief. It's not an issue for me. Or they even take it a step further and they judge, criticize, make fun of somebody who's talking about their grief.
Yeah, those are all valid points, and they're commonly made. With regard to the thing about, well, it's been 22 years, isn't that long enough? I mean, I have a couple of responses to that. One is the same thing I've said the other two times we talked, which is that quote from John Sarno, the unconscious has no sense of time. And the other thing I would say is, okay, so your father's been gone for 22 years. How many years did you spend with him in your life? Because I think that can be a factor as well. Sometimes I think it can take as much time as you spent with somebody or in a situation to fully complete with it. That there's a little bit of symmetry there that has to be addressed in terms of time and experience. As to the other question about men who would assert that they don't have any grief, that can be a tough one to crack sometimes. But it seems to me that everybody misses somebody in their life at one time that they were close with, that was part of their life. It can be a friend, it can be a family member, it can be a pet. Everybody has experienced loss. And I think that if someone is at all willing to acknowledge that they have at some point, then that's a good entry point to start that conversation.
Right. I think that's really important too, right? Is this acknowledgement of, like, everybody has loss. Everybody has the loss of innocence, the loss of their childhood. They have the loss of some family member, some friend. They have the loss of opportunity. Those people who are in recovery, they have the loss of the time spent in their addiction. They have the loss of the substance they were using. There's so much loss that people have that we don't give anyone, men, women, anyone, opportunity to truly experience. I mean, I was talking with one of my daughter's teachers who lost her father, and I tried to make it a point to keep asking her about how she was doing, because she was really clear. It's like, yeah, I got 2 days off after he died, but that's about it. That's about all I'll get permission for. And people are very friendly now, but what's going to happen in a week or a month when I'm having a hard time? And she was already anticipating it. And I was, like, really trying to be supportive, because, man, that shit comes at you from all directions. And this is what I've found. And that is, like, I could be 30, 40 years old. I can experience a loss of a job that can tap into some other grief and loss that I am not even aware of. I mean, I love that quote from Sarno. I mean, that's, like, really, really important. It's like the line from Magnolia, the movie Magnolia.
Mm-hmm.
You may be through with the past, but the past isn't through with you. And so all of this stuff can be so connected. Can you talk about that? Like, I'm somebody who's operating in my life, and I'm kind of going along pretty well. And, I wouldn't necessarily look back on my childhood and say I've had a lot of trauma. I'm playing the role of somebody who's listening. And, trauma, this, I I had some trouble in my childhood, but something comes along or came along, and I was 30, I was 40, I was 50. I hit this major wall. And then all of a sudden, shit just seemed to get really, really overwhelming. And I was flooded by like this depression or this lack of feeling secure about anything. How is any of that related to grief, or is it?
Well, I guess it depends on how much you've kind of paved over on your way there. I know that I can speak about my case, which is that, as I said, I came to a point in early adolescence where I lost my ability to express that emotional energy around grief and loss. And so consequently, as I accumulated experience, in my mind, in my observation of my life and other people's lives, you can't move forward and live and have a life without experiencing losses. There are always things that you wanted or that you thought you had and lost, or wanted and never had. And so if you don't have the opportunity, or you don't know how to experience the fullness of that loss so that you can feel complete with it, then those things begin to accumulate over time, and potentially they build up into something that feels very mysterious and very very difficult to define, such that if somebody asked you, like if somebody had asked me when I was 28, so what do you think is going on that your life's not working, I could honestly say, I don't know. I just know that it's not working. I know that I feel bad a lot of the time. I know that I feel like I'm in a lot of pain, and I know that every time I try to do something, it seems like it turns out wrong. That was the best answer I could give at the time. In retrospect, I can look at it and say, I was holding on to a lot of emotional energy around disappointments and wounds and emotional injuries and opportunities that I either didn't take or didn't come my way, people that I cared about that were gone. I mean, I wasn't processing any of it. I was just trying to get over it, as people say, or get past it, which is just sort of another way of saying, this is a difficult feeling that I don't have the skills to be able to handle or express in any other way other than to just kind of leapfrog over the top of it. And, in my experience, those things accumulate over time, and they can start to play out in your life in ways that might seem completely unrelated. The only thing being in common is that you get to a point where it seems like nothing is working anymore.
I had the image, and I don't know if it works, how well it works, but I did have the image of like a Jenga board. And so if you start out kind of with the full thing, you slowly start taking the blocks away, and while those individual blocks are coming out, the structure's becoming a little bit more unstable. When you pull that last one and the whole thing collapses, if you're not aware of the fact that you've been pulling these pieces out the whole time, it's hard to understand what's happening. But yet there's been this steady progression toward that collapse that has been happening. And so I think a lot of the times what befuddles a lot of people is the fact they find themselves in that collapse in a small way or a major way, and they don't have the understanding or awareness to see all the pieces that have been pulled away over time. And then that's the work. That's the work you get to do. I mean, ultimately, I think it's a gift to have that moment, that crisis, and maybe you get multiple crises or multiple kind of flashpoints of significant disturbance in your life. And I think ultimately it can be a gift.
Yeah, and I think that's a great analogy too. And of course, the temptation I've had many times in the past is, well, if I can just put that piece back in, everything will be okay. And to sort of focus on the piece that caused the whole thing to tumble, I think is a natural tendency. And oftentimes that is the entry point for somebody. It's like, well, if I can either restore what I lost, or if I can somehow get past what I lost, then everything will be okay. And I think in a lot of cases, that's that's going to be a disappointing way to approach things, because it's, the last piece is the thing that caused the whole thing to crumble. But the fact is the thing was on its way to crumbling for a long time. And that's the point where you either have to kind of dive in and address the whole thing and the whole history of it, or you try to do a little bit of spot repair and try to keep on going.
It's literally, we've heard this saying all our lives. It's the straw that broke the camel's back. And what that means is you keep piling the straw on top, and there's one piece of straw, and all of a sudden the camel collapses, but it's everything you've been piling up. The illusion is that it's that one straw, that does it. I want to go back, because I think something I try to be very mindful about, and I think you do as well from how I'm getting to know you, but I just think having compassion for men around all this stuff is so critical. I mean, so many of us live with such a fierce overseer inside of us who's just enforcing those rules over and over, cracking that whip of masculinity, keeping us from really being able to be fully self-expressed and open and honest with our loved ones and ourselves. And so for our listeners who have that and have it to varying degrees, I just want to reinforce how it's a very reasonable response to look at something from your past and say, but that was back then. I'm a 40-year-old man. I should just get over it. It was a long time ago. It didn't affect me. That. How do you make the connection? How do you make the connection if your orientation is get over it? If your orientation is that's something I've overcome. How many times have you and I both talked to somebody who basically said, yeah, I grew up in a pretty crazy family. I mean, it didn't really affect me, and I'm so glad about that.
Yeah, I guess the thing that comes to mind, the first thing that came to mind was, I'll just apply this to myself. If I catch myself saying something along the lines of, I should be over that by now, that tells me I'm not over it. I never tell myself I should be over something that I've actually finished. I only tell myself I should be over something that's where there's still work to do. And typically the motivation for me doing that is it's going to be too hard. It feels too difficult. I feel like I don't have the support. It's too frightening. Any number of things. So that to me is a way of saying, this is so mysterious. It's so frightening. I have so little confidence of my understanding my ability to actually do anything with this that I just want to call it finished because I don't feel like I have another alternative.
That's such a great point. I mean, that's one of those things that's so obvious and simple that it's elusive. And if I'm telling myself to get over something, that means there's something there.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah,
I love that. I love that. That's a great indicator for how there might be something there. How do you help the guys? I mean, who it's like a steel trap, man. I mean, it just it comes down so quick. That's just, I don't touch that stuff. I don't need to touch that stuff. I don't want to touch that stuff. And when men get really honest, there really is so many men, I believe, have that experience of I'm afraid that if I start crying, I'm afraid that if I start to get in touch with some of this stuff, that it'll never stop. It'll overtake me.
Yes, I've still, it's funny that you mentioned that. I'm glad you mentioned that because I'd forgotten I used to have that. I had that I had that feeling and that belief, I guess. It's both. It's a feeling and a belief that I had for a long time. And that was a real impediment. And I haven't thought about it for a long time because I don't have that fear anymore. I've done enough grief work to release that fear and condition myself out of it. The fear I still have, which is just visceral, it's at the core of my being and my physicality, is I still feel convinced I'm going to die. It feels like death to me. to get into that kind of deep grief. And for whatever reason, I still have not been able to, experience or condition myself out of that. And that is the main reason that I personally avoid it, because it feels life-threatening to me to go into that place still.
That's interesting that you say that it feels like death. I mean, it is a degree of a death, right? I mean, like there is it's I don't know, maybe this isn't the best way to say it, but I mean, it's like a death of a pain that has been haunting you. So it's like a positive death. It's not the death of us, like our best self. It's the death of that piece that has kind of been gnawing at us. And so it's like a healthy execution in some ways.
Yeah, and I would also say it's every time I do that, it's kind of a death by 1,000 cuts to that overseer, that you spoke about, who, at some point in my life, as I transitioned from boyhood to adolescence to adulthood, I developed a persona in myself that I came to believe keeps me safe. Part of his function is to make sure that I don't make myself vulnerable in situations where I'm going to get hurt. And so I think that it's, I think part of that feeling of like this is life-threatening is like it is threatening to a part of myself that I constructed as a protector. And it's threatening to the part of me that built that part that feels that the world is not safe and these feelings are not safe. And it all, as it does, I think for a lot of men, it comes back to control. Loss of control feels life-threatening to me. And certainly going into deep emotion, crying, grieving, there's an element of faith involved in that like I'm not going to completely lose control of myself and never come back.
Yeah, what's interesting, I mean, I think you just said that very, very well about that protector, because you can stand in judgment of a man and you can say, God, what an asshole. Or you could say, God, he's so shut down. But at the heart of it is that safety, is that peace that's the protector that says, you know what? I learned a long time ago that it hurts to hurt and to feel hurt and to be hurt. And so I've got this protector, and this protector keeps me from feeling hurt. I might hurt other people, but it keeps me from feeling hurt. And I think so many of us men, like that's one of the rites of initiation is we find that protector. We find something that we think is going to keep us safe. And as a friend of mine, Dr. Alan Berger, has pointed out, because I talk about safety all the time, I talk about how the man rules are a fundamental aspect of safety.
Yes.
When we stop crying, we stop being made fun of, and some of us stop being hit, and some of us stop being, abused. When we stopped asking for help, we stopped being told we were stupid and figure it out for ourselves. I mean, like there's a safety there. But what Alan Berger pointed out to me one day when I was doing this talk is he said, and it's safe, but it's not a healthy safety. It's not a affirming safety. It created a safety at a certain point, but now, as much as it's like a visceral response for a sense of safety, it's not a healthy or relational connecting safety.
Yeah, it's the phrase that came up in my mind when you were describing that was the safety of the grave. It's not you're not alive. You're not fully alive. And I think you made a great point too, that it's like I think it can be looked at as having been a very good temporary or transitional state or strategy that unfortunately gets anchored in at a very pivotal point in the development of our personality, so that we wind up forgetting what we were like before that. And the other thing I would add to that is, that as with so many things of this nature, there's not necessarily a single source point or a single experience that actually results in the construction of that protective persona. I can think of several things at critical points at that stage in my life. And one in particular, I think I was in middle school, and I was having difficulties in the mornings. I was feeling nervous before school, and I was feeling very vulnerable. And I think it might have been, there was a change of schools, or we'd had classes that had been merged, and there were a lot of new kids. And I was having a lot of trouble feeling anxious in the morning and not wanting to go to school. And I remember my mom telling me, if you don't straighten out, I'm going to put you in the hospital. And believe me, Dan, I straightened out immediately. Boy, did I straighten out. I mean, I learned, it's like, I better not show anybody this. I better not let anybody know I'm scared. I better not let anybody know that I'm having a hard time, because I'll be put in the hospital. I don't want to be put in the hospital. That's even worse. So, these, I think as men, we wind up in the state that we're in around being able to express vulnerability and sadness and grief in a healthy way that's appropriate and authentic for us as individuals. It's an amalgamation of experiences, not just, if it were just one thing, we could unravel it a whole lot easier.
All right. So you and I have spent the last 40 minutes talking about why there's some value, or talking about grief and sadness and all of this. And, any pragmatic person is going to say, okay, so what you guys are basically saying is, let's say it's true. Let's say I'm actually carrying a bunch of pain from the past. Why the hell should I touch it? Why should I deal with it? What are the benefits? Like, what's in it for me? What are the benefits of touching that pain? Because I hear you saying I might cry again, I might fall apart, I might, watch this artifice that I've created kind of crumble, but then what's there without it? What the hell? Why would I do that? What's the benefit of that, you idiots?
Yeah, that's well put. I guess my first response at this point in my life is, hey, look, man, if your life is working and you're happy and you're having the life that you want, and everything seems to be just kind of sailing along, and the people around you are everything in your life is working, and it seems smooth, and it's the life you wanted, and your relationships are good, then there's really no reason. I don't hear a reason for you to go in to actually do this kind of work. If the answer to, if the state of your life is different than that, if you are in ongoing problems where you don't feel satisfied with your life for whatever reason, be it relationships, be it your health, be it your work, be it just your general relationship with yourself, if you can even conceive of that, then I think it's worth looking at these things, because if there's something that's holding you back, I think it's worth exploring and doing the work to find out if you can clear it out, so that you can have a better life while you still have a life.
So again, everybody who's listening, I hope you hear that. It's like, if things are going well, do your thing, man. live your life. I mean, you might have some stuff. I mean, here's what I'll say. Whether it's a therapist or a personal coach or a group or something, I don't think there's a human being who can't benefit from that. So I think, unfortunately, we treat it as a 911 or a fire alarm, and it doesn't have to be. It could just be finding somebody to offer some additional perspective or guidance in our lives. And who doesn't need that? And who couldn't benefit from that? And so there's that. But if something isn't working, and I would say this for a lot of guys who may be listening, you may not be the best person to solely determine whether or not things are working for you in your life. Like, if you have a partner, just to simply say, how well do you think I'm doing of a workable life? How good is our relationship? How much are you feeling like the partnership you and I committed to create we're actually creating. Like, be willing to ask that question, be willing to hear that answer, be willing to get some outside perspective to help you answer the question that Rick is suggesting, which is, okay, maybe this is not something that I need to worry about, something to deal with. Because I think it's a very human tendency to not look in the direction of our pain and to convince ourselves fairly well that everything's good, that, you know, it's not like exactly where I'd like it to be, but overall things are good. Great family. Oh yeah, I love my spouse. Oh, the kids are great. Yeah, my job's not everything I had hoped, but it sure is okay. That's only a degree of honesty.
Yeah, that's a great counterpoint, Dan. And I was actually thinking along similar lines, even as I was saying what I was saying. You know, that my statement that, hey, if you look at your life and you're happy with your life and you're doing okay and your relationships are good and you're having the life you want, then, you know, why get down in the mud? That presumes that the person who's evaluating his life is being sort of relentlessly honest with himself about it, which, you know, sometimes we just, as you pointed out, sometimes we're not the best person to make that evaluation all by ourselves.
And it doesn't mean there's something wrong with us. It just means we're human. You know,
Yeah,
I mean, like, I just keep coming back to it. We're human. And I would just say, look, man, if you're a man in this society, I mean, when you think of the man rules, I mean, think about the man rules. Don't cry. Okay, there's a huge loss. Don't be vulnerable. There's a huge loss. Don't ask for help. There's a huge loss. View sex as the only way to be intimate. There's a huge loss. Always have power. Don't look weak. You know, I mean, I could go on, but those are some of the biggest rules. All of those have some degree of emotional, spiritual loss connected to them.
True. I just, you know, Dan, I never want to come across as somebody who's saying, you know, everybody's got to do this. I think that there has to be a certain level of I don't know, personal autonomy involved in the decision to get into this kind of work, because if you can't get behind it and you don't feel motivated by something, it's going to be real hard to do it.
I totally agree. And maybe it's less about saying everybody needs to do it, as opposed to everybody probably could benefit from it.
I don't disagree with that. I guess
everybody could benefit. Everybody could benefit from exercise.
Oh yes.
Some people need it more than others. But everybody could benefit from exercise. It doesn't mean everybody has to go out and exercise or has to do a certain kind of exercise. Everybody could benefit from, you know, there's all these certain things. And I think I totally agree. Everybody has their own journey. And boy, I tell you, something I've been working on a lot lately. A friend of mine told me this, and I thought it was so great. You know, I've been talking for a while about surrendering to the mystery of life, surrendering to the mystery of the universe. And he said, you know, that's one way of looking at it. But one of the things I learned from my mentor was you can surrender to the mystery of life, but it's a whole nother thing to embrace the mystery of life.
Yes.
And boy, that hit me square between the eyes. And it's like, you know what? I'll never know why my father left this earth, never really experiencing life, because he drank himself to death. And, you know, that's part of the grief I still have is like, I never felt like I got to actually meet the man that my father could have been and was. And there are hundreds of thousands of men who will die this year where that's their experience, and women who that's their experience, and people who are born in poverty. Like, that's all part of the mystery. And part of the mystery is that there's going to be some men who resonate with what we're talking about. There's going to be women who resonate with what we're talking about. There's going to be women who want the men in their lives to resonate with what we're talking about. And they may or may not be ready, but at least what I love about the topics that you bring to this podcast are, at least it plants a seed.
Yes, and I think at the very least, it's worth looking at your life periodically and asking these kinds of questions. And the important thing, as you said, in terms of planting the seed, is to know that okay, should you reach a point in your life where you feel like you're hitting the wall, or you're just not moving, or you're having the same difficulties over and over again, or you just feel dissatisfied and uninspired, you don't have to stay like that. There are alternatives. There are other pathways you can take to give you some more information about what might be at the root of some of this, so that you can work through some of it and get yourself back on track.
And I think what's I think what's really powerful about this whole conversation and this whole discussion is it's like everybody has the right to live their life and to have their own journey with all of this. But if somebody's listening to this podcast, if somebody's hearing our voices, unless somebody has tied them up in a room and is forcing them to listen to this podcast, or they're blaring it as they're driving down the street, because of course, who wouldn't do that? If somebody is listening to this podcast, that means they've already got something inside of them that's saying, this is worth exploring, this is worth listening to, this is worth paying attention to. There's something that may be here for me. And I think what Rick and I are saying is, and if that's the case, just be willing to listen to that. Be willing to let that guide you into this process and whatever it looks like. And it's not about men crying. Men's grieving and men getting in touch with their grief, it's not about men crying. I like to say, in many ways, it's simply about men being able to step into a measure of wholeness that's been taken away from us.
Yes, and I agree with that, and I would put it to kind of put it another way. I believe that grief is an important part of a man's maturation process. I'm convinced at this point that men who are unable or unwilling, for whatever reason, to fully experience loss and grief in their lives, there's a certain point at which their maturity is just not going to progress anymore.
I love that. Love that.
And I think that, people talk a lot about toxic masculinity and all this other stuff. In my mind, what we're talking about is developmental issues here, and a developmental path from a maturity, or from a masculinity that's immature to a masculinity that's mature. And
I like that too. I really like that too. And it's right in line with what I talk about, where I just say, conscious masculinity, where it's just, we're more conscious to our experience of life. I really like that about that maturity piece, because I think it's easy to dismiss grief and men's grieving as almost like a lack of development or a lack of emotional stability, when in fact what we're saying is actually no. It's actually a depth of maturity that a lot of people just don't have or give themselves permission to have.
Yeah, and there's this horrible cultural stereotype about, if you think about it, and even me, I know better. I think about a grieving man, I think about a man crying. It's like, oh, he's weak. Oh, he's a coward. Oh, he can't handle things. This is like, in my experience, it's just the opposite. It's like, it is a very strengthening process for a man, and that's part of where some of the maturity comes from out of it. It's a very strengthening process for a man to move into that space, which is scary, a scary place to go into, and really, really find out who he is under circumstances where he's on unfamiliar ground that feels like it's going to drop out from him at any point. That's one of the ways that a man finds out where his strengths are, what his inner resources are, and it's a confidence builder. It's an expansion of his sense of who he is as a man. It's just the opposite of what the stereotype is.
Yeah, so we have to get rid of that inner voice and that inner critic that so quickly can come up saying you're weak, you're less of a man, and all that. So believe it or not, Rick, but here we are again. We are at that point, man. We're at that point at the end of this podcast. It's been another great conversation. We're at the practical and tactical section, and you always have such great tips, such great pointers for people who may be moving in this direction. So What do you have for us? What would be your top 3 takeaways for the practical and tactical when it comes to men in loss, men in grief, men in mature emotional development?
Well, I'm going to give you back a variation on something that you've mentioned when we've done this before, the letter writing approach. I think it can be very helpful, especially for a man who feels that, I don't have any grief. I don't have anything that I haven't taken care of. I'm through it. I'm over it. I would say this: think of the person in your life that you've lost who was the most important to you, and sit down and write a letter to that person and really, really tell them how much you miss them in as much detail as you can. And maybe you, Dan, like with your dad, what's gone on in the last 22 years that you wish he could have been a part of, that he doesn't know about, some of the things you mentioned earlier. And as a matter of fact, it doesn't have to be a letter. I mean, you can do a little video on your smartphone. If you have a good imagination, you can have an imaginary conversation with that person and just tell them, just really get into it and feel how much you miss them. I think that can be an entry point for someone who feels like, I don't have any, all my feelings about that are over. I think you might find that there's still something there. The second one is to make use of the information that's in your body as much as you can. So same sort of thing. If you think about somebody that you lost, that you missed. Think about a pet that you lost, that you missed. Think about anything. It could be a job. And just, if you can, just kind of check in with your body and notice, hey, I feel a little nauseous right now. Hey, I feel a little flutter in my chest. Hey, I'm getting kind of a headache. Hey, I feel a little sleepy. Those are all clues that potentially that there's some emotion there that hasn't really cleared out all the way. And if you can kind of hang with that a little bit, you might have some insights come up and you might have some feelings come up around the object of your loss. The third thing I would say is, we've talked a lot today, Dan, about, when we think about grief, we think about crying. For me, the grieving process, particularly for men, crying is just one aspect of it. There's a fellow named Tom Golden who's very, very good with this topic. He wrote a book called The Way Men Heal. And he makes the point very effectively that one of the important aspects for a lot of men when it comes to successful grieving is to take some action. Take some kind of creative action. So it could be making some art. It could be making music. It could be building or restoring something that has some meaningful connection in you to the source of your grief. You can make an altar in your home in a little corner. You can, if you're kind of socially minded, maybe you start a community project in remembrance. So I think part of the problem that we have trying to help men grieve is that we tend to tunnel in on just the crying and the release of emotion. It's like, I think as men, we sort of have an innate natural impulse to want to build and create and make something out of our experience. And I think that to the extent that a man can do that, it's another way to move through the process and complete it. And I'll add one more, which I always like to say, find a men's group if you can. If you can find a good men's group, you'd be surprised at how helpful it is to be in a room full of men that will sit there with you and be your witness and be supportive and not challenge you and not criticize you as you move into a grieving experience. It's so powerful. It's so counterintuitive based on what most of us have been brought up with. And you also will benefit from being in the room when another man grieves. We need to teach each other how to do this as men.
So you have brought this up several times before, and I want to get a little more specific information because I think we could put this out in general on our website. If I'm convinced at this point that it would be really beneficial for me to find a men's group, how the hell do I do that?
Oh boy, that is such a good question. I was actually thinking about that today, and I was thinking, God, do I need to start building a directory on my own website? I guess the best way I know how to do it is locally, because you can find, there are people that are doing men's groups online, but if you want something in person, I think that probably the first place I would go is the Psychology Today website. They will typically have location-based listings for people who are doing men's groups.
Really?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Yes, I've actually found some that way.
Okay, Psychology Today. Okay.
Yeah. And I think if you, just off the top of my head, Dan, I think if you just go to Psychology Today website, there's probably a search window somewhere, and you can probably type in like men's group Austin or something like that. But I mean, it's not hard. I've done it before. And also, depending on the size of the area you're in terms of population, there might be a local psychological society. Like I think there's an Austin Psychology Society or something like that, where practitioners list, and they have groups listed there too as well.
And I think there's also like I know in Minneapolis, when I lived in Minneapolis, there was an actual men's center.
Yes, those are few and far between, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, why would that surprise us, right?
Yeah, they do exist. And I, not to discourage anybody, but I'm in a large metro area here. Austin's like 800,000, I think, or something like that. And it's still hard to find a men's group here. There just aren't enough of them. And it's kind of a chicken and egg thing, Dan, unfortunately. It's like, I've talked to facilitators who say, hey, I tried to start a group and nobody showed up. And I've talked to men who said, I tried to find a group and there wasn't one. I think we just haven't quite hit critical mass on that yet, but they're out there. There are definitely groups out there. I've been in some very good groups in the past that were phenomenal and were pivotal in moving me forward in my own process of trying to be more mature as a man in my masculinity. And so they're out there.
Well, I'm going to make sure we find some links to not only put with this podcast, but to put on our general site for the podcast as a whole, so that people can find some direction, because I think that is so critical. And men's groups have been a huge part of my experience. So
Rick, for anybody that's listening, Dan, look, if you feel enterprising and you want to put together a website that's a directory of men's groups, I don't think such a thing exists. I've never seen one.
I think you're right.
It's a great idea.
I think we could use that. Let's do this. So I really, really want to thank you again for bringing your wisdom and bringing this topic to us. I want you, if you would, to share a little bit about how our listeners can find out more about you and your work. And I understand from talking to you that you've just launched this new service that you're offering, and maybe you want to talk briefly about that as well.
Yes. As before, I have a legacy website out there. It's rickbelden.com. It's very content rich, has a lot of information about the topics that Dan and I have talked about. And that is, obviously that's free for anybody to go out there and explore. There's a lot of posts, my poetry, my artwork, links to interviews like this and so forth. I also have a brand new website called rickbeldencoaching.com. And that is my website that I've created for offering coaching for men. And the primary purpose that I'm offering this with is to help men who are feeling stuck get their lives moving again, which is something that I talked about several times during the podcast today. So if you're interested, go ahead and visit rickbeldencoaching.com. You can set up a free discovery session with me. We can visit and determine if we're a good match to help you get moving if you feel like you're stuck.
Yeah. So thank you, Rick. Thank you again. Thanks to all of our listeners for such a powerful topic. Let us know what you think about this. Again, we always love it when you take the time to review the podcast. And again, have a wonderful week, and thanks for tuning in. Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Man Rules Podcast, where we don't let the rules rule us. If you're enjoying this podcast and our guest, please take a moment to give us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever else you may be listening, and let others know about our podcast as well. If you have ideas for guests, topics, or even would like to be a guest, send us an email at ideas@themanrules.com. Check out our website and everything we're up to at themanrules.com. Because the only question we have to ask is what kind of man you want to be and what's keeping you from being that man.